yesterday to do the planning or to start discussions around the planning for the 2025 edition. The 2024 edition is dedicated to industrial policy. It also introduces a new approach to comprehensively assess progress on sustainable industrialization. And this is done in the context of Agenda 2030 with a focus on 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And those are SDG 9, which is around industry, innovation and infrastructure, SDG 7, which is around affordable and clean energy, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. The report is the result of extensive research and work efforts by UNIDO's research team and numerous partner research institutions and policy makers from all over the world. The analysis covers 4 different regions, namely Africa, the Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, and the Caribbean. Today, we'll be discussing the main findings and also key messages for Africa. The program for the event, just to remind you, you probably all saw it, we'll start off with opening remarks by Mr. Nelson Mufu, who's the resident coordinator of the United Nations in South Africa, and also by Dr. Diego Macera, who's UNIDO representative for Southern Africa. That will then be followed by presentation of the key findings and messages of IDR 2024 for Africa by my colleague Alejandro Lafopa, who's the IDR coordinator at UNIDO headquarters, and a presentation of the industrial policy landscape and policies in action in Africa by Professor Fiona Trigena from UJ, and then that will be followed. That will set the scene for a roundtable discussion on the future of industrial development in Africa and how can modern industrial policy support structural transformation for SDG acceleration. For that discussion, we'll have 4 participants, 1 joining us online. And right here, I need to just insert an apology. I am challenged by some of these names. It's like going to gym in order to get your body in the shape that it needs to be. Your tongue needs some exercise in order to be able to pronounce all of these names correctly. So I have permission from our participants to call them by the first name after introducing them initially. So we have Mr. Banji Oyelaran Oyeyinke, who is the Special Advisor to the AFD President on Industrialization. We're having Ms. Phyllis Wakihaga, Senior Advisor and Global Lead for Industry and Commerce at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. We've got Mr. Dr. Emmanuel Ohusu Sekere, Director of Research Policy and Programs of the African Center for Economic Transformation, and Ms. Pamela Modliwa, Head of Research and Information at the IDC. So, and then we'll move on from there. After we've listened to our panel, we will then move on to a Q&A session where we open the floor for questions from our audience, online and in person. And then we'll have closing remarks by Dr. Macera, by Diego Macera, and then we'll have, that will be the end of our program, and we'll move on then to a small reception of refreshments for our guests in the room. So without further ado, I would like to then introduce Mr. Nelson Mufu, who's the resident coordinator of the United Nations in South Africa. I'm quickly going to read you his bio while he comes up to the podium. Mr. Mufu is resident coordinator. He assumed this office in December 2022, following his appointment by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Before this role, Mr. Mufu served as Chief of Staff at the Head Office and Principal Strategic Advisor to the UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. As a strategic coordinator and policy advisor, Mr. Mufu played a key role in guiding the UN's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. He also coordinated the Global Crisis Group's efforts for on the UN's response to the war in Ukraine and the Decade of Action for the Sustainable Development Goals. Throughout his career at the UN, at regional and country levels, and at the UN Secretariat, he gained extensive experience in program coordination, management, partnerships, communication, stakeholder engagement, advocacy, and mobilization. So, Mr. Mufu, The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Program Director. And I always cringe when I hear bios being read and this thing, but it's a pleasure to join you all. And thank you, of course, to Diego, Alejandro, and all the other colleagues who are in the room. And I wish you a happy stay in South Africa, and certainly those who are based outside of South Africa. I hope you enjoy your stay here. Also acknowledging colleagues that are online. It is obviously always a pleasure to be able to welcome you to such events which the UN family, and in this case UNIDO especially, is pulling together. And this regional launch of the Industrial Development Report for 2024 certainly is a crucial publication as we look at how we collectively shape interventions that will help us accelerate achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We're 10 years in, we have 5 more years to go. We certainly are not making the progress that needs to be done. And so we need to look at catalytic interventions, underpinned, of course, by industrialization that will help us achieve as many of our goals as possible. And I say this because as we gather here today, and on a continent that really requires ambitious interventions, we're faced certainly with the urgent need to accelerate our efforts to promote trade, to embrace the just transitions, to look at how we do not get left on the side as critical minerals are being leveraged for the transitions, and how the natural resources and human capital of the continent can also really be channeled and harnessed properly. It's a continent that has a lofty ambition of being transformed by 2063. And so the question I always ask myself is whether we're on track and whether we're leveraging the resources that we have in abundance, particularly starting even with young people that are extremely energetic, dynamized, but also suffering from unemployment. So the question becomes, what can we do through industrialization to course correct and set the continent on the pathway it needs to be on? And so I'm really happy that something that used to be a popular notion decades ago, industrialization, is back on the table. In the South African context, we hear of deindustrialization. In other countries, we hear about the quest and the need really to step up manufacturing and to better position the continent to take advantage of something that we really need to do, which is the AfCFTA, for example, which is about trade across the continent and positioning Africa in the world in a better manner. So this industrial development report highlights that globally implemented industrial policies have more than doubled in the past decade. And so it underscores a clear trend that countries are increasingly turning to strategies that guide their development efforts and are underpinned by industrialization. And it's not only about expanding the industry in itself, but it's also a means, as we've heard actually from the program director, about achieving broader development goals. And being on a continent that is rich in natural resources, there's no doubt that for us to be able to achieve as many of the sustainable development goals that we possibly can between now and 2030, we must look at how particularly SDG 9 can play its part. SDG 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure. And if we do it right, the spillover effects, a lot of us are looking at catalytic intervention. So the spillover effects will really ensure we have far-reaching benefits that will particularly look at poverty reduction of inequalities, but also ensuring decent work. This is familiar to the South Africans in the room and online because the triple challenges the country is facing is really around high levels of inequalities, high levels of poverty, and also unemployment, particularly for young people. So therefore, industrialization remains a powerful engine for job creation, innovation, and economic growth. In fact, one of the key priorities of the midterm development plan of the new South African Government of National Unity is around inclusive growth, but job creating inclusive growth. And this also is something that we look at when we talk about the 6 catalytic transitions for SDGs. Industrialization is not named as one of them, but it underpins all the efforts that really we need to look at when we talk about driving the transformation of food systems, leveraging the just energy transition, looking at digital connectivity, ensuring that through education we have the skills needed for the world of today and the future, and also advancing climate action. And the only way we really can do all of this is really if we look at, from an African perspective, how we expand and prioritize industry, commerce, manufacturing. I pause to really look at something that I always consider is transformative as an opportunity for South Africa, for example, leveraging the just energy transition and the partnership it is embracing. The only way it is going to reindustrialize and scale up industrialization is by taking advantage of the value chains of the just energy transition and looking at renewables landscape and how then this then gets infused in its manufacturing future. And this is really something that the report highlights as well as opportunities going forward for Africa to also embrace. We need to look at how Africa transitions towards higher productivity, innovation-focused industries that can provide growth opportunities and certainly also economic resilience. In the South African context, like I said, if we're looking at unlocking industrial development, there are 3 issues we could focus on. First, we must avoid the repetition of new enclave economies and take advantage, for example, of how critical minerals could drive value addition and cross-sector linkages, especially in new and emerging green economies or industries. Secondly, I already mentioned the importance to leverage the AfCFTA because these new markets that are growing presents Africa with new opportunities to benefit from manufacturing investments. And this is something that also we can take forward. And thirdly, we also need to push for massive investments in cross-border infrastructure and value chains. And that's why also this report that has a continental outlook and working with the UNIDO office here that also has a sub-regional outlook helps significantly to look into this. And South Africa and the Southern Africa region can really set an example for the rest of the continent as we look at accelerating the energy transition and leveraging the ecosystem around that through manufacturing. And there are a number of things that we need to look at which are also challenging, because one can ask the question, how can South Africa revitalize its manufacturing sector and meaningfully contribute to job creation and economic transformation? Why has this not been the case over the last 30 years where decline has been seen? So this is really something that I hope as you discuss, and unfortunately I will not be here for the panel and exchange, but as you discuss and think about these things, the results that come out of your deliberation should really help position us as we move forward. In our context in the UN in South Africa, we're going through a design of a new cooperation framework. We're assessing what the current context is and how our response should be. We're looking at how we can leverage, particularly something that the government says it wants to do, which is embrace the 4th industrial revolution and move beyond that into the new economies for the future. And really we need to answer how green industries can really help transform livelihoods. And we hope that what comes out of the discussions today, the recommendations contained in the report itself, will really drive meaningful change and help us over the course of this year and beyond. This is really, really pertinent because South Africa is also chair of the G20 this year. And of course, it is using that and the platforms there to look at how to make a difference, how to contribute meaningfully to the continents, not only the countries' ambitions. And this is, as we know, something that really is important as we look at how financing also can play a way in ensuring successful industrialization. And so the G20 provides a platform for that. The Financing for Development Conference in Seville provides an opportunity to look at that and other milestones over the course of 2025. So as I end, I really wish you all the best. I welcome you again. And I hope that Diego and other colleagues, when I depart, will keep on representing the UN in South Africa flag well. And we wish you all the best and welcome once more. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much to Mr. Mufo. As he said, we need to excuse him now, unfortunately, but he's also given very important inputs for our panel discussion later this morning. So our next speaker, doing also a set of opening remarks, will be Dr. Diego Macera, who's the UNIDO representative for Southern Africa. I'm now a little bit hesitant to read any bios, so I will ask Diego to just add what he thinks is essential for you to know about him before he continues with his opening remarks. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody from the floor and online. It's an honor for me to be here. And but what is important, maybe from my bio, is that I'm the UNIDO representative for Southern Africa. So we are based in Pretoria, South Africa, but we cover from our office 10 countries in the region or the sub-region. And as Nelson mentioned, we are putting a lot of efforts on connecting on a regional policy and structure that take advantage of the African Free Trade Continental Agreement and link countries through industrialization, trade, and based on the local endowments, and more importantly, on the capacities of the people of each of the countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and colleagues, good morning. It is a great honor to stand before you today at the Africa launch of the Industrial Development Report 2024, UNIDO's flagship publication that continues to provide critical insights into the evolution of industrial policy and its role in sustainable development. This report comes at a crucial moment when industrialization is not only a pathway to economic prosperity, as Nelson mentioned, but a necessary strategy to navigate an increasingly complex and unpredictable global landscape. Allow me to begin by expressing my deepest appreciation to Nelson Mufu, the UN Resident Coordinator, for his leadership and unwavering commitment to sustainable development in South Africa through the UN country team. Your presence today highlights the importance of a coordinated multilateral approach to industrialization, one that brings together governments, international organizations, private sector leaders, and academic institutions. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the University of Johannesburg and the IDC, our esteemed partners, and their invaluable collaboration in making this event possible. The world is currently undergoing rapid transformations, driven by unprecedented geopolitical, economic, technological, and environmental shifts. The evolving global order, shaped by supply chain disruptions, economic fragmentations, energy security concerns, and shifting alliances, is compelling countries to rethink their economic models. Trade tensions, regional conflicts, and climate change-induced disasters are forcing nations to reassess their industrial strategies and enhance their resilience against external shocks. Industrial policy has thus become a central pillar of the national development strategies, providing the framework through which governments can navigate these complexities while fostering sustainable economic growth. This year, the Industrial Development Report, IDR 2024, titled Turning Challenges into Sustainable Solutions, the New Era of Industrial Policy, addresses precisely these pressing issues. It presents a compelling case for industrial policy as a transformative tool for structural change, allowing countries to align economic development with sustainability, technological progress, and social inclusion. The report underscores that while the challenges are immense, Well-designed industrial policies can stimulate innovation, create quality jobs, and promote environmental sustainability, ensuring that no country is left behind in the rapidly evolving global economy. Africa, in particular, stands at a crossroads. The continent has made significant progress in areas such as energy access, resource efficiency, and infrastructure development, but major challenges remain. The report highlights that while some African countries have successfully leveraged industrial policy to drive growth, others still face hurdles related to skills development, digital transformation, and access to finance. The need for a regional coordinated approach to industrialization has never been more urgent. The Industrial Development Report 2024 presents compelling case studies from across Africa that illustrate how industrial policy, when well structured and implemented, can drive economic transformation. Just to give some examples, Ethiopia's manufacturing expansion, the country has actively pursued industrial policy through special economic zones and public-private partnerships, boosting its textile and garment sector. This targeted approach has increased export competitiveness while creating thousands of jobs, particularly for women. Another example is Morocco's green industrialization strategy, through which strategic investments in renewable energies and sustainable industries, Morocco has positioned itself as a leader in solar energy production and electric vehicle manufacturing, demonstrating how industrial policy can align economic growth with environmental sustainability. South Africa also, through the automotive sector transformation, a mix of incentive, localization policies, and strong industry-government collaboration has turned South Africa into an automotive production hub, attracting more major global car manufacturers and creating a thriving supply chain that extends across the region. Final example is Rwanda's digital leap. The country has strategically invested in digital infrastructure and innovation ecosystems, transforming Kigali into a hub for ICT-based industries and demonstrating how industrial policy can harness the power of technology-driven development. These examples illustrate how industrial policy can be tailored to different national contexts, leveraging a country's unique strengths while addressing its specific challenges. They also highlight that industrial policy is not a static concept, but an evolving one, requiring continuous adaptation to technological advances, global market shifts, and emerging social and environmental concerns. As we engage in today's discussions, we must also acknowledge that industrial policy is no longer just about production and economic growth. It is about resilience, sustainability, and equity, as Nelson mentioned. The African continent is experiencing the fastest growing youth population in the world, and with the right policies in place, this demographic shift can become a powerful engine for industrial transformation. Investing in skills development, innovation systems, and cross-border trade integration will be critical in ensuring that Africa not only catches up with the global industrialization trends, but becomes a leader in sustainable industrial development. The road ahead will not be without challenges. However, the solutions lie in a deeper collaboration, strong policy coordination, and an unwavering commitment to sustainability and inclusiveness. UNIDO remains steadfast in its mission to support African countries in designing and implementing effective, forward-looking, and regionally coordinated industrial policies that will shape the future of the continent. Today's event is an opportunity to reflect and exchange ideas, forge partnerships that will help Africa turn its challenges into sustainable solutions. In closing, I encourage each of you to engage actively, share insights, and contribute to shaping the next phase of African industrial journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diego, for those opening words. Also, again, very useful as part of the background to the panel discussion that we'll have later on. So we're now moving on to a presentation by Mr. Alejandro Lapopa, who's Research and Industrial Policy Officer at UNIDO at the headquarters. He has coordinated the production of the report, and he will also provide now a short overview of the main findings and messages. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Petro, for the nice introduction. Good morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to participate in this important event. As Petro mentioned, my name is Alejandro Lapopa, and I have coordinated the production of this report. And in what follows, I will try to summarize in 15 minutes the IDR, which is a report of 200 pages, to which we have more than 100 contributors. So please bear with me. I will try to do my best. So let me start with some general insights regarding this edition of the IDR. And as Diego mentioned at the beginning, this is the 11th edition of a long series. The IDR is the flagship report of UNIDO. It has more than 20 years of history. And each edition has a specific thematic focus. And in the IDR 2024 edition, the thematic focus, as was already indicated in the welcoming remarks, has been industrial policy for SDG acceleration. And this edition also brings a very important innovation. This is something we have not done in the past. That is that we have included in the report one part which has specific regional chapters trying to bring insights for Africa, for Asia Pacific, for Eastern Europe, and for Latin America. And these specific chapters have been produced in close collaboration with regional partners. We have been working with regional research centers. We have been working with UN economic commissions. We have also been collecting input from UNIDO member states from these regions. And of course, today I will base part of my presentation on the chapter of Africa that we have produced in close collaboration with the University of Johannesburg, with a team led by Professor Fiona Tregena, who will then make a presentation on the insight they have brought into the report. Now, let me go to the content of the report. And the point of departure of this IDR is the so-called polycrisis. And you might wonder, what is the polycrisis? This is just, let's say, the name that we are using to indicate the impact of several global crises that have happened, that have hit the world in a very short span of time. So in less than 4 years, the world has faced a health global crisis, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, a geopolitical global crisis related to the armed conflict in Ukraine, but also more recently the war in Middle East, and a climate crisis, no? That is, the effects of climate change have been increasing and having more impacts in the world. And the result of this global polycrisis has been that unemployment has increased, poverty has increased, hunger has increased, there has been disruptions in value chains, there have been increase in inflation all over the world, and ultimately, this has a severe impact on the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. No? And this is information coming from recent estimates by the United Nations that indicate that standing today and thinking that the time horizon of the Agenda 2030 is precisely 2030, and there are several targets that this agenda has, only 15% of the targets can be regarded as being on track. The other 85% of the targets are not on track, meaning that by 2030, it will be very unlikely that these targets are achieved by developing countries. And maybe what is even more worrisome is that 37% of these targets are actually going backwards. So countries are not making progress on these targets, but they are moving further away from the target. So against this background, the main question we want to address, or we try to address in the report, is how can we accelerate progress towards the achievement of these SDGs? And the answer we propose is that any strategy to accelerate progress should put industrialization at its center. And this is something that was already stressed by Diego and by Nelson. But let me give you a bit more of details of why. Why should industrialization be put at the center of any strategy to accelerate progress in the achievement of SDGs? Well, basically because industrialization and the manufacturing sector has very important linkages and spillover effects to other sectors of the economy, helping progress across not only which is the SDG that has industrialization as one of the targets, but also all other SDGs. And to illustrate this, in the report, we propose a very simple framework in which we identify direct effects of manufacturing to other SDGs. For instance, the creation of jobs, which is at the core of SDG 8, or the development of new technologies to facilitate energy transition, which is at the core of SDG 7, or for instance, the production of food, which is at the core of SDG 2. And we could continue, and you can see the details in the report. But then, more important, we also identify indirect effects. And these effects take place through the effect of industrialization on these, specifically SDG 8 and SDG 7, which then have effect on other SDGs, both related to the socioeconomic aspects and to the environmental aspects. And this is key. Industrialization, by driving economic growth, by driving job creation, has impacts on all other socioeconomic SDGs. And by the same token, industrialization, by driving the development of green technologies, has also very important positive effects on those SDGs which are related to the environment. So, in the report, and this is mainly coming from the second chapter, we make the case for industrialization. Why is industrialization important? And this framework illustrates that, but then we support this with empirical data for each of the channels that we identify. But then the next point that we highlight is that industrialization doesn't just happen. And I think here in Africa, this is very clear. There have been efforts trying to support industrialization for a long period, but this doesn't necessarily happen. What we are going to report is that industrialization, industrial development requires policies, requires industrial policy, but not just any type of industrial policy. What we propose in the report is that modern industrial policies, those policies which will help addressing these issues that we have indicated, should have at least 4 fundamental elements, which are the following. First of all, they should have a very clear mission. They should be mission-oriented. And in particular, these missions can be driven by the SDGs. So it could be, they should be, ideally, SDG-oriented. And then I will give a bit more of details on that. Secondly, they must be future-ready, in the sense that they need, from design, they need to prepare for the future, taking into account those big megatrends that Diego was already mentioning, which are reshaping the industrial landscape at the world level. Third element, they should be collaborative, in the sense that they should be produced in close partnership with the private sector and other stakeholders. And finally, they should be regionally coordinated, and this is crucial. This is key, especially in the context of Africa. These policies should not create tensions among neighboring countries. They should try to leverage on the possibility of strengthening regional value chains, for instance. And we think that this is a fundamental element that, especially from UNIDO, we are trying to support. Now, because of the time in the presentation, I will just focus on the first 2 elements, SDG-oriented and future-ready, and try to bring already some insights for the Africa context. For those interested in the other elements, you can find it in the report in the chapter 3. So, what do we mean when we talk about an SDG-oriented policy, and in particular, how an SDG industrial policy should be designed? In the report, we argue that an SDG-oriented policy should start with the comprehensive assessment of the progress that countries and regions have done in the achievement of those SDGs which are most closely related to industrialization, to industrial development, which, as I was mentioning before, there are in particular 3 SDGs. I mean, this doesn't mean that other SDGs are not important. It's just that a focused SDG industrial policy would benefit from looking specifically on these 3 SDGs. Of course, SDG 9, which is the one that contains industrial development as a target. But on top of that, SDG 8 and SDG 7, for the reasons I have just explained. These are the SDGs which have the higher indirect impact due to industrial development. So in the report, we introduce a novel approach to assess progress along these SDGs. For each of these SDGs, the UN has established a number of indicators. And what we do is, first of all, for each of the relevant indicators, we define a clear target, because this is something that has not been defined when coming up with Agenda 2030. So we define a clear quantitative target. And then we cluster these indicators in broader dimensions. No? So there are many indicators, we cluster them, and then we end up having 9 dimensions. When it comes to SDG 7, we look into energy access, energy efficiency, and clean energy. When it comes to SDG 8, we look into employment, economic growth, and resource efficiency. And when it comes to SDG 9, we look into industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Okay, so details of the methodology I will not give now, but we are always open for questions, and then we can discuss that. Now, let me show you the results for Africa on these 9 dimensions. Now, here I will present a very nice figure that we have been using. Probably has a more formal name. We call it a flower figure, in which we just plot these dimensions. And these numbers I will show you is the average values for the Africa continent. Now, these are average for all countries. So please take it as that. It's an average. It's just an illustration of where one could think Africa is standing. And for each of the dimensions, we have, we're going to see where the continent is standing between 0 progress, which will be standing in the center of the circle, and target achievement, which will be standing in the border of the circle. Now, let me start by showing you the results for SDG 9. Remember, we have industry, innovation, infrastructure. And here you can see clearly that there are very important gaps to be addressed when it comes to SDG 9. You can see SDG 9 industry and SDG 9 infrastructure, is just 1/3 of the target achievement. And maybe more important, when it comes to innovation, we can see that the target achievement on average for Africa, and this is for the latest year with data, is only 7%. Okay, so very important to highlight these gaps so that industrial policy can try to focus on supporting these particular dimensions. When it comes to SDG 8, we have again these 3 dimensions: resource efficiency, economic growth, and employment. And here we can see a bit of let's say, a better picture in which in 2 of the dimensions, resource efficiency and employment, Africa stands almost halfway the target. But then there is 1 dimension, economic growth, which is only 1/3 of the target. And finally, when it comes to energy, the picture looks much better in terms of target achievement. We have 2 dimensions, energy access and energy efficiency, in which the region is standing at almost 60%. But then we have 1 dimension, clean energy, which is still very far away from the target. And here, of course, there are plenty of opportunities. Now, in our assessment, we look at 2 things. First, where is the region standing, let's say, when in the latest year with data. But we also think that we also see the dynamic. So how fast the region has been reducing the gap or increasing the gap in the situations which were not ideal. And this is what is shown in the outer part of the figure. You can see these rectangles with colors. Don't pay attention to the numbers, just pay attention to the colors. And the greener the rectangle, the faster the region was reducing the gap to the target. No? So these are dimensions in which the region has been progressively very well. But then there are dimensions which are painted in red, which are dimensions in which the region has been moving away from the target. No? So these are really problematic dimensions of the peak. And here we have economic growth and employment. So also a sign of alarm in employment. Based on this assessment, then we identify a number of dimensions in which the region has been progressing well, and a number of dimensions in which special attention needs to be given from an industrial policy design perspective. I will just keep this here, and again, stress that this is an average for the continent. This will be very different when it comes to sub-regional analysis and when it comes to country-level analysis. Now, and I am already closing, let me move to the second element that we mentioned for modern industrial policy, which is being future ready. And here, what we have in mind is that these policies should take into account the megatrends which are reshaping the global industrial landscape. And in particular, in the report, we focus on 4 megatrends, namely the energy transition, the fourth industrial revolution, the reconfiguration of global value chains, and demographic transitions. And again, I will not go into the details of this. This is explained in the report. But let me just mention that in the report, for each of these megatrends and thinking on industrial policy design for the future, we also identify specific opportunities to expand the manufacturing sector based on these megatrends. And just to give you an example, when it comes to energy transition can provide opportunities for countries to expand their manufacturing sector by producing those components, those inputs, those goods, which will be needed for energy transition. Let's say the most clear example would be electric vehicles, but of course, together with electric vehicles, there is a whole value chains of different inputs, different components that will need to be produced. And again, here then there are opportunities. And in the report, we also illustrate these opportunities with the specific cases, as Diego was mentioning, of industrial policies in different countries of the continent, which has already been trying to leverage on these megatrends to support the industrial sector. And this is something that Fiona will cover in her presentation next to this one. So just to finalize and summarize the main narrative of IDR 2024, and now thinking on the roundtable discussion that we will have later. So our departing point is to sign that SDG progress is at risk, especially because of the poly crisis, but also before COVID, the progress has not been the necessary to achieve the 2030 agenda. And therefore, we need strategies to revert this trend. And in the report, we argue that industrialization will be key in these strategies. But of course, industrialization doesn't happen alone. It requires industrial policy, not any type of industrial policy, a modern type, which has these 4 elements that I have indicated, and therefore can ignite this transformative power of industrialization. And finally, we illustrate all this narrative with specific cases of policy in action for different regions of the world, and in particular for Africa. So thank you very much. And
thank you very much, Alejandro, for that very insightful summary. It's a pity we can't spend more time on that, and we'll be sharing the link to the report. There are hard copies available in the venue, but for our online participants, we'll be sharing the links to the report, the complete report and the summarized one. So our next presentation will be by Professor Fiona Tregena, who's head of the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development, and she's also professor at the University of Johannesburg. Fiona led the preparation of the background report produced for IDR 2024, and her presentation now, as Alejandro also indicated, will focus on the current industrial policy landscape and policies in action in Africa. Fiona, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for the introduction. As the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development, really delighted to be partnering with UNIDO and the IDC in co-hosting this Africa launch of the IDR this morning. And very happy to have been working with UNIDO on the Africa part of the IDR. With a team comprising myself, Professors Elva Savenyo and Alexis Habiaremye, and Doctors Phumzile Ncube and Wex Asiyama. And we're already working with UNIDO on the 2026 IDR. I think the resurgence of industrial policy internationally has been well recognized. That the importance of industrialization and industrial policy is now widely accepted, and there's a much greater emphasis on it than was perhaps previously the case. And this is also so in Africa. In fact, I actually think that the resurgence of industrial policy in Africa might even have started before it became more prominent as well globally. In our, this is not, this one? Yeah, third device, lucky. Yeah, so in our report, we began by scoping the landscape of industrial policy in Africa. I'm not going to take time on the details, but we have basically characterized industrial policy in terms of different categories of industrial policy. The framework or rolling, so the kind of generic industrial policies, such as here in South Africa, we have IPAP and the National Industrial Policy Framework. Sector specific, so those which are focused on a particular sector, agro-processing, auto, whatever. Cognate policies in related areas like competition policy, trade, investment, and so on. And then industrial policies which are focused on emerging issues. These are the types of issues which Alejandro also drew particular attention to in his presentation, such as technological change, the green transition, and so on. And we've also categorized industrial policies in terms of their level. So here I'm showing two of them, those which are at the continental level, such as the AU industrial policy, the AFCFTA, those which are regional, for example, for West Africa, or COMESA in the case of competition policy. And then those which are by country, so between two countries or a subset of countries, but not necessarily regional. For example, an agreement between Zambia and the DRC. National industrial policies, we've got some examples here, for example, at the sectoral level, Kenya's auto policy, Uganda's green manufacturing strategy, and then those which are at the subnational level. For example, Lagos State has its own industrial policy. Here in South Africa, we have as a cognate policy, the Gauteng Township Economy Revitalization Strategy. So these are just illustrative examples of the scope, the extent and the variation in industrial policies that we're finding across the continent in efforts to accelerate industrialization. In our report, we've also identified key areas of opportunity for industrialization, growth and development in the continent. One of these is clearly green industrialization. The green transition and both the challenges and opportunities that it presents are increasingly prominent in the discourse and policy development around industrialization in Africa as well as globally. It's really key for African countries to move more quickly in terms of the design and implementation of policies that will enable the continent to seize the opportunities associated with the green transition and to protect against the threats associated in particular with not moving fast enough. As we know, and both Diego and Alejandro have also referred to this, African countries have abundant natural resources for renewable energy, including solar, wind, hydro. But in capitalizing on those opportunities, it's really crucial that we don't limit ourselves to simply the use of natural resources for renewable energy, but also go further in terms of upgrading, adaptation of productive capacity, so in order to exploit the windows of opportunity which are there. So this involves both producing new products and producing perhaps old products, but in newer ways, in more sustainable ways. And for African countries to move more quickly in terms of manufacturing green energy, production equipment, and supplies. Another area of opportunity, perhaps it's a kind of part of the industrial policy toolkit, but which may have particular relevance for some African countries, is the use of industrial hubs and zones. These can be particularly relevant for African countries which still have fairly nascent manufacturing sectors or which are quite distributed spatially. But as we know, even in a country such as South Africa, these are well utilized and associated with upgrading of productive capacities in the manufacturing sector. Also allow manufacturing firms to take advantage of the benefits of agglomeration and clustering and provide opportunities for upgrading. In our report, we also focus on innovation and technological upgrading. Again, one of the mega trends that Alejandro has referred to in his framing presentation, with the growth of frontier technologies, for firms and countries that don't move fast enough in closing that digital gap and the broader technological gap can quickly get left behind in the industrial development process. These technologies present opportunities for boosting competitiveness and possibly even for leapfrogging. One of the advantages perhaps that late industrializers have is through when these technologies can be accessed, it can actually accelerate the industrialization process. This is also linked closely with the green industrialization pathway because innovation and technological advances can enable more efficient and sustainable production techniques and the production of also higher quality products in order for African countries to access new export markets internationally. We also identify global and regional value chains as a key route of opportunity for industrial development in Africa. It's about integrating with these regional value chains and global value chains, as well as upgrading within them towards more sophisticated products, more sophisticated functions with greater degrees of value capture within the RVCs and GVCs. Amongst African countries, there's certainly scope for building stronger regional value chains. For example, in agro-processing, in auto manufacturing, in green energy, in the pharmaceutical industry, and so on. These regional value chains can allow African countries to capture a greater proportion of the value. So rather than importing from other parts of the world and only having a segment of that production regionally, that production process can be integrated across African countries in order to boost industrialization within the continent. Closely linked to this is the AFCFTA, which has already been referred to by the other speakers. And the opportunity that this presents really as a game changer for industrial development, growth and broader socioeconomic development and contributing to the SDGs in Africa. Lastly, we can look at the potential of resource-based industrialization. As we know, Africa is endowed with rich natural resources. And the challenge here is for us to move beyond exporting those in a relatively unprocessed form, but to rather use them as a springboard for industrialization in Africa. And here we look in particular at agriculture and mining, which are both areas of strength on the continent, and using those to move up and along the value chains so as to introduce more manufacturing in the processing of those resources. This entails greater investment in a long-term knowledge base so that African countries can capture a more substantial share of the value chain from these natural resources to the final product. We can look at case studies of success in Africa as examples of what can possibly be done. Although African countries face certainly challenges and constraints in terms of industrialization, it's by no means a gloomy picture. And sometimes it just takes some kind of digging to uncover what are some of those successful stories. Sometimes it's a large firm, sometimes it's at a country level or a sub-regional level, where African countries are actually making already some headway in terms of industrialization. Here, without going into them in detail, these are some of the case studies that we discuss in our report. It's not to suggest that any of these are without their own challenges. They're all work in progress. But if we look at the diverse areas in which some of the success is being observed, ranging from green industrialization, innovation and technological upgrading, RVCs, those areas of opportunity that I just discussed earlier, and from all regions of the continent, it's illustrating that there are some possibilities out there. I'm just going to touch briefly on two of these by way of illustration. Firstly, the Kantanka manufacturing, auto manufacturing in Ghana. This has been supported by Ghana's auto industry development policy, which emphasizes vehicle assembly and the manufacturing of auto components. KM is a local Ghanaian company that assembles vehicles using locally sourced materials and components. And one of the ways in which the Ghanaian government has supported it beyond the broad auto policy development is also as a purchaser. So government agencies, departments, and so on purchase these vehicles as a way of supporting the industry. At the moment, production is still at a small scale, realistically. But I think it's showing an upward trajectory and is also moving into electric vehicles as the next step. So also aligning with that green transition. When we look at the role of industrial policy in supporting this nascent industry, we can see the importance of market creation as well as government incentives. The second and last case that I will just use to illustrate some of these potentials of success is in a quite different industry, the pharmaceutical industry in Egypt, which is quite a long-standing industry, but also supported in its expansion by government policy. Industrial policy in Egypt has sought to expand domestic technological capabilities and to incentivize local production. And the pharmaceutical industry has been able to tap into those support measures in order to grow. There are currently about 170 manufacturing facilities within the country, so it's already quite a substantial established industry. And the vast majority of these are under ownership of domestic Egyptian companies. The pharmaceutical industry is also contributing to meeting a large proportion of Egypt's own domestic needs in terms of pharmaceutical products. So this connects with the meeting of basic needs, and even if we look at it in terms of the various SDGs, the health SDG has contributed to enhanced health outcomes. It's also making a significant contribution to Egypt's balance of payments through exports. So these are just two illustrative case studies. We will be exploring additional case studies for the next IDR. Of course, each one is unique. And as I said, many are still in a work in progress, but I think present learning opportunities for policymakers across African countries in terms of what can be done practically in this pathway to sustainable and inclusive industrialization. Thank you.
Can you just please advise how do you take this off? Thank you very much, Fiona, for a very interesting presentation. I saw that there was some positive responses online also to the presentation, especially when you got to the part about opportunities. So based on these presentations, we are now ready to dig deeper into the issues that were raised. And for that, I'd like to invite our panelists to come forward. I'd like to introduce them one by one. So the first one is Mr. Banji Oyelaran Oyeyinka, who is the Senior Special Advisor to the African Development Bank president on industrialization. He's joining from Abidjan. Again, in order to, in the interest of time and in order to make sure that we don't run too far over time, I'm not going to go through their bios. The second person to join us is Phyllis Wakiaga, who's the lead for industry and commerce at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. If you could please join us in front here. The third one is Emmanuel Ousa-Sekere, Director of Research, Policy and Programs of the African Center for Economic Transformation, a Pan-African think and do tank based in Ghana. And then we've got Pamela Modliwa, who's the Head of Research and Information and also the Acting Head of Industry Planning at the IDC. So if you could please join us in front here. I assume we should use, yeah. Okay, hi, that sounds better. Okay, so our first round of questions, we're going to have 2 rounds of questions for each of our participants or panelists, and we're going to give them 2 to 3 minutes to respond. Banji, I'm going to start with you. We're witnessing a renaissance of industrial policy across the African region, with governments increasingly recognizing the role of industrialization in advancing the SDGs. Considering the megatrends such as digitalization and the green energy transition that are reshaping production, and then also looking towards the future, what kind of industrial policy actions can African countries take to advance sustainable and inclusive industrialization?
Thank you very much, moderator. I hope you can hear me. Yes. So let me, because of, in the interest of time, I'll just focus very narrowly on 2 or 3 keywords. First is the notion of inclusiveness and sustainability. And by that, I mean, in this context, I know the report has covered quite a lot. I think the earlier speaker has actually reviewed all of this, so I'm not going to go to all of that. But I want to single out 2 in terms of the actors that we want to talk about in industrialization when we talk about inclusiveness. First is those who live in the rural areas in Africa. And there are 60 to 70% of most countries, they live in that zone. Second are also those who live in the cities, the so-called informal sector. In most African cities, there are also close to 60, 70% in those sprawls. If we don't use industrial policy to address those groups, we are not going to ever eradicate poverty. The SDG 1 and 2 will never go away. So that's my first point. And I'd like to give an example of China, for example. Many people talk about Chinese industrial growth. China lifted 800 million people out of poverty. They were not those living in Beijing or Shenzhen or in the big cities. They were those living in the peripheries, those who live in the rural areas. So what China did was to focus on where the problem is and took action to ensure that all of those people are educated, they were empowered for their own human agency. They were, given skills, particularly to TVET type of training and vocational training education. And those people who were hopeless and poor in the past became a big market for China. And I think that is where actually the growth of China is. The real source of growth starts with eradicating that scourge, because as you know, studies have shown when you have these big issues of low income in rural areas and in the cities, it is a drag on economic growth. They have so many children, they have all of that, and the economy will always be in a drag. Second point I would like to make is also on what action do you take? In our case, in the Africa Development Bank, what we did was I said earlier, to go to where the problem is, the food sector. and the associated agribusiness. I don't hear much of that. And I myself used to be a big machinery capital goods person until I started working with the African Development Bank. $12 trillion, or about $10 trillion of global GDP, and about 12% of global GDP actually comes from the food system. The agri and food system is bigger than IT, bigger than auto, bigger than iron and steel. All of them, in most cases, are about a quarter of the agribusiness and food sector. And I think Africa should focus on that because that's where we have our comparative advantage. So industrial policy should target that. In the case of the AFDB, there are two things that we did. The Technology for African, TAT, we call it, Technology for African Agricultural Transformation. In Ethiopia, I'll just give an example of Ethiopia. We started in 2018 with supporting Ethiopia with about, I think about, 5,000 hectares of land, giving them, climate resistant, drought resistant seeds. And today, Ethiopia's wheat is about 1.6 million hectares. Ethiopia used to be a net importer of wheat. Now they export to Djibouti and Kenya. Ethiopia is totally self-sufficient in wheat. And it's across about 9 commodities, including maize, including all of that. And by the way, all of the global leaders, none of them neglected this area. The US, the EU, all of them are totally self-sufficient in food. And the US is the biggest exporter of food today. The Netherlands exported 100 billion euros of food last year. So I think that's an area we need to pay close attention to. Let me just stop there.
Thank you very much for that very interesting input. My next question will be to Phyllis. First, let me just quickly get to your question, sorry. Okay, so the participation of the private sector in the process of designing and implementing industrial policies is key to the success of such policies. In your experience, why is this collaboration between public and private actors so important when it comes to industrial policy making? And then the second part of the question, how can this collaboration be better facilitated in the context of Africa?
Thank you very much for the good question. And before I dive into the response, allow me to congratulate Alejandro and the team at UNIDO and also the University of Johannesburg, led by Professor Fiona, on the excellent work on the report. But you've asked me to lean on my experience in private sector to explain why I think it's important. I've spent the last 20 years in private sector development. I used to be the CEO of the Association of Manufacturers in Kenya for almost 9 years, and I learned a lot during that time. First of all, an important thing is that industrial policy requires a whole of government approach. I think when we listened to Alejandro present, he did speak about the importance of collaboration as one of the critical enablers that's going to lead to successful industrial policy. And why I think it's important, especially in the context of Africa, first of all, we know the private sector is the engine of the economy in Africa. The private enterprise creates the majority of jobs, drives the GDP growth, and that I think is so important. You can't ignore such a huge demographic. The second reason why it's important, from what I've seen in practice, is the essential market information and intelligence that private sector brings into the policy making process. They understand the global trends, what is happening, and all of this, once inputted into industrial policy, leads to it being very successful. You're then able to identify any of the binding constraints that they are going through. The other reason they're important is that way you make policy grounded and implementable. I've seen a number of cases where government has gone ahead, developed a policy, and when it's come to implementation, it's stalled simply because private sector was not involved. But when we bring private sector in early, it's able to address some of those challenges. The fourth reason is also because industrial policy requires both public and private sector investment. and what they both bring to the table. The private sector brings the capital, the agility, the innovation, and government brings the long-term vision, the infrastructure, and the incentives. So all this coming together, I think, is very important. Fiona has shared a number of good case studies, but I was also going to lean in on the Kenya industrial policy around the automotive sector. There was a lot of coordination, collaboration with government, and that led to the successful growth of that sector. That was the same case in Ghana, as we saw. Another one is the Morocco's automotive sector and the Kenya packaging regulations. When I was at the Association of Manufacturers, we co-developed with government extended producer responsibility and ensured that we created an environment where SMEs were able to transition into the environmental goals around waste management. The second part of your question was how we can strengthen this collaboration. What I think I've seen working is institutionalizing public-private dialogue. In a number of countries, they've tried to do it, put in place public-private dialogue forums, and those forums are important for consultation and for really designing and involving private sector in the full cycle of policy making. The other thing is also that co-development. We've seen in some of those successful strategies where you then work with private sector to co-develop these industrial strategies, and examples are like the East African pharmaceutical policies and also the Ethiopia textile strategy. Another area where I think we can strengthen collaboration is around SMEs, because they are also a majority in Africa, and sometimes their voices do not get heard in the development of industrial policy. So ensuring that we have ways to include SMEs very systematically, and also other groups that are left out, like women. One way we did it when I was in manufacturing was working on the Women in Manufacturing program, launching that, involving women more in the manufacturing sector. And the last one I'll speak to is introducing delivery scorecards. Having scorecards that we measure and look at what progress we are making. I've seen that work in a number of countries where government and private sector agree on scorecards that they can work on. I know the ease of doing business was discontinued, but that was one example of a scorecard that was used to improve the business environment. So thank you very much, and those are my thoughts on why it's important.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Then, Emmanuel, I'm moving to you next. In your experience monitoring and assessing Africa's structural transformation at the African Center for Economic Transformation, what are some of the key results you found in terms of the region's economic transformation? And then secondly, how can African countries continue to diversify and add value to their production?
Thank you very much. And once again, congrats to Alejandro and Professor Fiona and the UNIDO and the UJ team for such a brilliant report. So at ASSET, we conceptualize economic transformation as growth with depth. Depth is D as in DEPTH. It's an acronym that stands for diversified production and exports, export competitiveness for the E, P stands for productivity of labor, T stands for technology upgrades, and H stands for human well-being. The idea is that the reason why we grow is to improve living standards. So how you grow must ultimately improve human well-being. We came by this acronym by studying a number of early transformers in East Asia and the Pacific and the Latin America region, whose socioeconomic landscape was just like ours half a century ago. So we're like, what happened? How come they've made so much progress and African countries haven't? So a country like Ghana was just like South Korea 50 years ago. Today, Ghana's per capita GDP is $2,300 and South Korea is $49,445. So the question is, what did they do that we didn't do? Or what didn't we do that happened? And we are able to identify 5 key factors among the Asian countries and Latin American countries, severally and individually and jointly, what they did. They diversified production and exports, they enhanced their export competitiveness, built the right skills to improve labor productivity, upgraded technology, and improved human well-being. So we have a flagship that tracks some 30 African countries, progress in economic transformation using the growth with depth framework. These 30 countries represent 86.5% of Africa's total GDP, using data from 2000 to 2020. The key results we found is that Africa is not doing well at all on economic transformation. Our progress is slow, weak, and vulnerable to shocks. And three key areas of concern is that we have become less diversified over time. The array of goods and services we produce is shrinking. We are moving more towards primary commodity exports, and our export competitiveness is very poor. In fact, we performed poorest on that indicator, scoring 13.8 on the scale of 0 to 100. And the key culprit for that is declining manufacturing sector, poor infrastructure, inappropriate skills, minimum cross-border value chains, reintegration challenges, and strong challenges to movement of goods and people within the continent. In terms of how we can continue to diversify better our production and exports, one key thing is to revisit our industrial policy action plans. They have to be apolitical and long-term, inclusive and sustainable. You notice that the industrial policy action plans in most African countries are actually political party manifestos. So when the party goes out, the next party comes, throws everything out the window, and the countries keep moving in circles and never forward. In the process, we have to put in strategies to stop exporting primary commodities and move to value-adding options like Uganda, Botswana, Zimbabwe are currently doing. We have to better align our FDI attraction to our development industrialization aspirations, because you go to a country that owes trillions of dollars in infrastructure debt and you can't find one single road. So ask yourself, where did the road go? Where did the money go? Which infrastructure debt is this? You find it across many African countries. There's just one road from the airport to the president's house, but the country owes trillions of dollars in infrastructure debt. And we have to also exhaust the full complement of economic resources, especially gender and the youth. We have a majority youth population, and women are severely excluded from economic activity across the continent. Our level of skill must be applicable to our industry and labor market needs. And then finally, the sustainability challenge, climate change impacts, and nature loss. We need to address those two dimensions as we strive to industrialize. Thank
you. Thanks very much, Emmanuel. Now, Pamela, we move to you. The presentations earlier highlighted the importance of industry in driving structural transformation and sustainable development. In the case of South Africa, what kind of policies and priority sectors have been identified as key in the country's industrial strategy? And then also, can you share with us some of the results of these strategies?
Sure. It's still morning. Good morning, everyone. And also congratulations to Alejandro and Fiona and the teams that compiled the report. I think these are all very useful, and it's always important, particularly to see experiences from other countries that we can learn from. So I think I'd like to make a distinction between the two dynamics of structural transformation, that being sectoral transitioning as well as sectoral deepening. So in terms of sectoral transitioning, South Africa, at least since about 2007, when the National Industrial Policy Framework was introduced, really focused around building the capabilities in manufacturing. So there was a lot in the industrial policies around how do we leverage our mineral endowments, and add value to them downstream, what we refer to here most typically as beneficiation, but also around how do we leverage the capabilities that had been established prior to democracy in order to support, I think, increased participation in the economy. And there were a number of incentives that were created to support this. So I'm only going to mention just a few. And so one of the popular ones, I think, was the Manufacturing Competitiveness Enhancement Program, which was introduced after the global financial crisis. And this was really around assisting manufacturing companies to reinvest in their capabilities, in upgrading in order to become or maintain competitiveness. And I mean, you still see the effect of the crisis in the performance of South Africa's manufacturing, and we are yet to fully recover from that shock. But what's interesting about that is that the design of that policy has evolved, of that incentive has evolved over time. So initially, what companies had to do is that they'd need to apply, get approval, make the investment, and then claim back from the state. And then reviews of that found that actually what that meant is that it was benefiting companies that already had access to finance. So if you were trying to solve the issue of access to finance, then that design wasn't necessarily optimal. So then the design was changed. And now the fund is managed by the Industrial Development Corporation, where I work, leveraging the capabilities of the organization to evaluate projects and to be able to then disperse those monies to companies that would need it. And I think that emphasizes the idea that industrial policy, like production, is a process of learning by doing, and we need to constantly be reflecting and see how we can improve. I mean, we've also had, tax incentives. I think the 12I is quite interesting because it was designed particularly to support investments in greenfield and brownfield projects that were going to utilize either innovative processes, or cleaner production technology, so that was something that is in line with some of the, I think, issues that have been raised in the document around the importance of that upgrading. There's been public procurement, of course, as well as the use of trade policy. So this is some of the cross-cutting incentives that have been available to manufacturing. Then from the perspective of sectoral deepening, which is within one sector moving to activities of higher value addition as well as productivity, I think I'll reflect on the automotive sector, which both Fiona and Diego have already spoken about. So the industry in South Africa has probably received the most targeted industrial policy package. And this has been the case since about 1995. And we see the impact of having a policy of that nature to support an industry. So as indicated, it's been a combination of investment incentives, trade protection, but also then a rebate system that allows you to actually benefit from the trade protection if you are using local content, right? And so this has been instrumental then in driving and developing the component manufacturing level of the value chain, which is where you have higher labor absorption, but you also have higher value addition. But this has also been complemented with other interventions. So for instance, South Africa is probably the biggest producer of platinum in the world. We have the highest reserves. So we leveraged that endowment to produce catalytic converters, which are largely made from platinum. So the intervention around supporting the production of catalytic converters was also linked, and today catalytic converters is our strongest automotive component export product. So I think it's highlighting again the looking at tools that sit in multiple government departments, because industrial policy isn't about the work of the Department of Industrial, of Trade and Industry, which is what is the focus in most countries. And we've seen quite a bit of success. So I think just to give you an indication, in 1995, the automotive sector accounted for 4% of total exports in South Africa. In 2024, this was 14% of total merchandise exports, but 26% of total manufacturing exports. So there are areas of improvement there, but I think it's a clear illustration of what can be achieved when you do have that targeted approach. At a broader manufacturing level, I think the results have been mixed. We've seen, for instance, the country's manufacturing sector performing relatively poorly when you compare it with peer upper middle income countries. And so I think even within South Africa, there's still quite a number of opportunities for us to grow and see what additional instruments we can adopt to be able to support that growth. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Pamela. So now we move to our second round of questions, and we start again with you, Banji. Is he still online? We can, okay. So the IDR 24 points to manufacturing as the leading engine of job creation. We know that for every job directly created in manufacturing, 2.2 jobs are created in other sectors. Africa's population is projected to be 3 times larger in 2050 than what it was in 2000. What role do you think the manufacturing sector can play in generating decent jobs for Africa's growing population, particularly the youth?
No, thank you very much, Moderator. I think let me answer that in 3 parts. One is particularly mentioning youth. Youth need financing. I think this is an area where we've had big issues with young people. Youth business is always viewed as very risky. Many of them finish school, they don't have jobs. So I think one of the steps we've taken at the Africa Development Bank is to start what we call Youth Entrepreneurial Investment Banks. It's a new model of investment financing. We are testing now in about 5-6 countries in all of in West, East, and Southern. And the idea is to do around 15 of them by the end of this year. YABE, as we call it, actually finances young people's business throughout the whole project cycle, from project studies, from feasibility, right on onto operations. That's one very big step that we feel will encourage job creation. Second is also something that in our focus on industrialization seems to always be neglected. That is the technical training. For most of Africa, when you look at the structure, the hierarchy of engineering right up to artisanal, it's almost like an inverted pyramid. In my country, for sure, I know I've done a study on it. ILO prescribes about, at the top of the pyramid, you have about 8 to 10% engineering. Level 2, you should have about 70% training of technical people. In Africa, we lack that. In most countries, you can't even find a decent plumber or artisan to do decent job. And many people know about the German lifelong training, where people keep getting continuous training in industry to ensure that their skills are world class. Many Africans just want to go to university. It has been a big problem. Second dimension of it is entrepreneurship. I think we need to focus more on encouraging young people to do innovative things and establish entrepreneurship. That is where the jobs are going to come from. Not everybody looking for white-collar job in offices. The final point I would like to make is on structural transformation that the last speaker was talking about. 250 years ago, Europe transited from subsistence agriculture into modern agriculture and then to industry and then now services. That is a progression for structural transformation. If you go to Asia, in 1964, 63, after many years of drought, India achieved their own green revolution. Africa has neither achieved green revolution nor industrial revolution. As long as we have 70-80% of our people in rural areas doing menial jobs, back-breaking jobs, low skill, low technology, lack of knowledge, we'll never achieve structural transformation. I mean, in a famous study that was done several years ago by the World Bank, I believe, there were only 13 countries that actually modernized their economies without industrializing. And for me, industrialization is synonymous with structural transformation. All of them, I mean, those ones you see, major oil producers like Qatar, Brunei, and all of this who have the money to do whatever they like. All the major countries, starting from Britain to continental Europe to America, all of these countries have to industrialize. And so we know that manufacturing is the engine of growth. I think it's an established fact among all of us, on this panel. No matter what anybody says. In fact, anyone that tells you don't industrialize is your enemy. I always tell my students, you've had this before. Oh, you don't have to do it. Go to services, go to this. Anyone who tells Africa not to industrialize is an enemy of Africa. I have never stopped studying it. And I think it's a way for us to go. And we need to also put our foot down and not be waved here and there by fads that goes on. And by the way, I think industrialization studies and policy never stopped. It never stopped. And I saw in the Industrial Development Report study, you saw how big money is being given to the CHIPS Act in Europe, in America. It never stopped. It just went under the radar. So Africans should never stop pushing for industrialization. And we are not asking that we should be making rockets or SpaceX or whatever. We are saying we should be able to produce what we eat, what we drink, what we wear, textile garments. We should be able to, at least at the basic level, what we write, like automotive. Not all the countries in Africa is going to be making full automobile. We can make parts. And I end up by saying that AFCFTA, I'm a member of the Council on Industrialization on AFCFTA. We should take it very serious. The speaker that gave the summary said, it's not just going to be by something you write in a paper. You have to have very strategic actions. Africa should take AFCFTA very seriously. It's our last hope. It's the biggest trade area. And we should do everything possible to make sure it succeeds. And we should trade among ourselves, manufacturers, not trade cassava and millets among ourselves. We will remain poor. Africa should trade manufacturers. The trade among Europeans is 80% manufacturers. In Asia, it's going up to 60% manufacturers. And I think this will be really my point in tying manufacturing to structural transformation. It has to be by a focus on transforming subsistence agriculture. I mean, a country like South Africa has gone further ahead than many of the countries. And by the way, and I end with this, in 2023, January 23 to 25 in Dakar, there was a big forum of what we call Feed Africa, organized by the FDB, AU, and we had a number of heads of state that were more than they ever even had at the AU meetings. And the focus was on food security, food sovereignty. And everybody agreed at that meeting that Africa should never again be subject to a position where we are begging for food, just like we're begging for drugs. So for me, the first order of business is that Africa should transform its economies through huge investment in moving the rural folks into a modern industrial agricultural system. And by that, we'll be able to eradicate poverty, and that we'll be able to now move into real manufacturers. Produce your foods. As I said earlier, $10 trillion, that's what the food system is worth. And by 2030, it will be worth $1 trillion in Africa. That's a big market. It's a big market. So these rural poor who are living under $2 per day now will become a big consumer group if we move their spending and income to, maybe $10, $12, $15 per day. So I believe industrial policy is, for me, number one. Industrialization is an issue we should never listen to anybody else but ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that input. Next, we move to Phyllis. So here, the question for you. The IDR 24 underscores the importance of establishing clear priorities and targets to frame industrial policy. However, when it comes to implementing those policies, we often find duplicity and lack of coordination between government institutions. In your experience, how can governments maximize synergies and increase the impact of industrial development policies?
Thanks again for a very, very important question. For the last 3 years, I've been at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And what we do is we work at the center of government to help political leaders get things done. So those 3 years have given me a bit of experience in addition to the private sector side to sort of just see how policy is implemented. But one of the big things is that it's really not lack of strategy, but the lack of proper execution and delivery that appears to be a big challenge, especially within the continent and other developing countries. We have many well articulated industrial plans and policies, but they not able to meet their full impact because, first of all, there's duplicity in effort. You find different parts of government doing the same thing. There's also overlapping mandates and that weak coordination between ministries. So allow me to share a little bit about some of the things we try to do to improve coordination at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So the first thing is we try to think full stack, have a 360-degree approach to policy design and implementation, and we do it through 4 things. That is strategy, policy, delivery, and technology. So from our lens, strategy is basically where you set your national ambitions. So we spend a lot of time, like when I work with countries on strategy, just looking at what the national ambition is, what is the overarching vision for the leader, and ensuring that those strategies are cascaded within the government. But when you stop at strategies, it's not enough because in a lot of cases, they are not translated into actual action plans, and I think the previous speaker spoke about that. So the second thing we do is support on policy, which is really the rule book, and how you then translate this into actions that can be implemented. So working very closely on incentives, the regulations, the frameworks that enable governments to get things done. And this has been critical because we're also able to translate them into action plans for different sectors and different parts of the economy. The third thing is on the delivery, now actually getting things done. And that's where a number of countries struggle. We need very clear systems with clear KPIs and delivery mechanisms. So we support a lot in the execution of this work, having clear KPIs for the different areas we're supporting, putting in place delivery units, either at national level or sometimes even at ministry level. So having, for example, industrial delivery units in certain governments that we are working in. And then the execution then also requires technology. And I think in today's world, governments really need the digital tools, first of all, to track the implementation, to manage how they even support business and lead to an enabling business environment, managing the permits, monitoring industrial zones, and many other things. So I think the strategy, policy, delivery, and technology has been very critical in the work that we do. Then the second part is really about looking at how we support in building state capability so that we achieve this industrial policy success. And this requires that the state is really working on setting a clear direction, aligning the institutions and driving delivery. So 3 practical things I think I've observed in this work is, first of all, having that strategic alignment at the center. As we know, industrial policy should really be driven by a national industrial vision, because the reality of industrial policy is that it cuts across different ministries. So you can't fix fiscal issues at the Ministry of Industry, you'll have to collaborate with the Treasury. You can't fix infrastructure at the Ministry of Industry, you have to work with the Ministry of Industrialization. So what has been seen to work and what is important is anchoring it in a national vision, and then that does what Professor was talking about. It goes beyond even political terms, because the national vision then drives a more long-term plan. The other thing then is creating delivery mechanisms and pockets of effectiveness. Sometimes you might not be able to fix entire government, but if you have those pockets of effectiveness that have been driven by the national vision and they have the clear KPIs, they're coordinating within the different ministries, it makes a difference in terms of driving industrial policy. And I think the Rwanda Development Board is one good example where we've seen investment, skills, and industrial planning under one roof, and really with a central leadership and guidance from the president there. The last thing I'll mention is those cross-government convenings and platforms to address bottlenecks and unlock challenges across sectors. So we are able to convene roundtables, task forces that bring together different government departments for coordination, and even involve the private sector development partners to ensure that we are able then to deliver on this industrial policy. So those are some of the things that I think.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that. Emmanuel, we'll move to you. African industries often face the challenge of accessing markets and increasing productivity. Regional integration plays a key role in increasing access to markets and in enhancing competitiveness. In this sense, what role can regional economic agreements, such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreements, play? And in turn, what will a deeper regional integration mean for Africa's insertion in international markets?
Okay, so your question is in three parts: the access to markets part, and then the competitiveness part, and then integrating into global markets part. So let me take one at a time. The AfCFTA itself, by its nature, is the largest market since the formation of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. It covers, as of February this year, Africa's population is 1.5 billion people, and with a market value of $3.4 trillion. So that's a huge market access. Now, what it hopes to do, actually been ratified by 48 out of 54 African states. And what it hopes to do, the phase one looks at, deals with trading goods and services, and then dispute resolution mechanisms. Now, with trading in goods, it looks at issues like tariff reductions or ultimately eliminate those tariffs, customs cooperations, rules of origin, non-tariff barriers. By removing tariff and non-tariff barriers alone, you're enhancing market access. And then with services, we're looking at liberalizing priority service sectors like transport, financial services, communications, etc., and tourism sector, business services. So all those, what it hopes to achieve by itself will enhance market access. The Guided Trade Initiative, which is like a pilot run of the AfCFTA meant to test its operational readiness, was started with 7 countries. Now you have 39 countries that are part of it, so it's expanding. And one key challenge we've had on the continent is cross-border payments, real-time cross-border payments in trade. So the Pan-African Payment and Settlement Systems of the Afrexim Bank, called the PAP system, has really helped with cross-border real-time payments. But we also need to explore other innovations like fintech innovations that are emerging. And just in 2023 alone, intra-Africa trade increased by 3.2%, which is so progress has been made. The fruits are beginning to bear, and the benefits are beginning to show. In terms of enhancing our competitiveness, the AfCFTA seeks to boost Africa's industrialization by helping us to add value to our raw materials and also establish cross-border value chains that will help us diversify production and exports and improve our competitiveness, reduce our reliance on import dependence or reduce Africa's import dependence. If you're able to remove tariffs on 90% of goods, as we hope to do, goods will be cheaper in Africa and on the continent. The customs cooperation also addresses the systemic inefficiencies you have in our border crossings. It's very difficult to move goods, reduce the paperwork, the duration it takes, the number of documents you need, the cost of actually moving goods and services across the continent. And then one other area is the easy movement of people. If some countries have skills deficits, other countries have skills surpluses. If you're able to get skills to move freely, you'll be evening out the skill deficits in countries, and that will have a positive effect on our productivity. Now, in terms of how it will help Africa to integrate into global value chains and international markets, African countries are small open economies. And individually, we cannot compete at the global level. So a single market strengthens Africa's global position, especially trade negotiations and deals, and reduce our dependence on exports. Go to most African countries, a lot is imported. In some countries, something as simple as toothpick is imported from China. That's unacceptable. And it means, of course, a single market is also more attractive to global investors than individual countries. Let me end by saying, though, that there are still a couple of challenges that we need to deal with. Like the domestication of the protocols at the national level, national development plans don't have the protocols in there yet. There's a very low level of economic complementarity between our countries. We do the same things. We produce the same thing, either your natural resource and that, or you are agrarian economy by nature. So who does what? There has to be some very creative and strategic thinking around how we form these global value chains. And then one challenge is the movement of people across or within the continent. It's very difficult to move within the continent. I remember Dangote said he needs 35 visas to move within Africa. How much more an ordinary businessman? So the air travel connectivity is very, very poor. And then for trade, it's easier to bring something from Latin America or China to East Africa compared to from another neighboring African country. And of course, we need to explore alternative cross-border payment systems to enhance real-time payments. Because if we cannot pay each other in real time, we cannot trade. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Pamela, you are the last person in our second round of questions. We often see that industrial policy does not achieve the anticipated impact. The IDR 24 identifies the lack of implementation capacity as a critical barrier to successful industrial policy. What actions are needed to increase the capacity of state institutions to design and implement effective industrial policies in Africa for a greater impact?
Thanks. I think that's a very interesting question that's worth unpacking over, a much larger conversation. So I'll try to be brief. And I mean, I think the starting point is that industrial policy can create both productive and extractive rents. So the design element then becomes quite critical. And of course, there's no point having a beautiful policy if it's not going to be implemented. So those two factors are really important. The report already covers a number of strategies that countries can adopt to build the capacity both for design and implementation. So I won't repeat any of those, but I'll try to complement what is already in the report. And first, I think it's worth highlighting, and Phyllis has also already mentioned, that it's not necessary to wait to have all the capabilities to start, because if you can find just pockets of capability and competence within the government, you can leverage those and then see how to build that up. And that's something that we see from late industrializers such as Japan, South Korea. They've done similar things, so we can learn certainly from those. Then the second point I'd like to make is, which has been an observation, is that there's been an increasing use of consultants within the industrial policy space. This is, of course, good because then you get to have external expertise that can be brought into public institutions to assist with these challenges. However, I think it's quite critical that that design element isn't completely outsourced to consultants. And this is for a number of reasons. One is that the implementing institutions, right, have a lot of understanding of the political economy dynamics of the particular country, the particular industry. They interact with the industry, with the companies that will benefit or not benefit from the industrial policy, that's being designed, and that understanding is really critical for optimal design. And work that I did with colleagues from the Center for Competition Regulation and Economic Development, really showed that part of what underpins South Africa's, the poorer performance of South Africa's industrial policy has really been around the political economy dynamics, right? So it's clear that the firms that were developed in the early stage of our industrialization were able to gain a level of power initially through market power in particular industries, but we are aware that this sometimes tilts. So then when you're trying to introduce industrial policies that aren't necessarily in the interests of those particular firms, there are levers and sources of power that these firms are able to engage with. And it's not just firms, then there are other pockets of power, both official and unofficial, within an economy that can be leveraged. And so usually I think in economics we'd say, well, in political economy studies, that we'd say that the policies that succeed are those that are in line with the distribution of interest. Now, if you want to break those power dynamics, you have to be aware of it. You have to be aware of the sources, and you have to be aware of how it's leveraged. And though there's quite a number of training on some of the technical aspects of industrial policy, it's been rare to see training on how to engage with political economy dynamics. So certainly something that I think can be considered. Then the point that I made earlier around the importance of reviews, I think is something that I would emphasize again, because the review of previous implementation becomes critical materials for understanding how we can improve. And also, if there's transparency around those reviews, then it's easier to hold, the implementers accountable where implementation has not been in the way that it has been expected. Then I think the fourth thing that I'd like to highlight is really around internal capacity building. So the report talks about, bringing in external, which is very important about learning new techniques. But I've worked in 3 public institutions, and from my experience, the capacity building that has been most impactful has been that which is internally designed and executed, because this facilitates learning from the more experienced public officials to either a newer or entrance into that space, but also allows for the cross-sharing of problem-solving techniques, context-specific problem-solving techniques from one function to another. And so this is something that we should also, I think, seeking to highlight in these areas. Then the next thing is really around sharing information with peers. And I've seen in some institutions where there are exchange programs, so you can go and work at the same. So I work at a development finance institution. I could work at another one for for a period of a few months. In that way, I get to learn the techniques that they use and maybe insights that I could then bring back into the institution. So this is also quite an effective way of gaining new skills. And I mean, we do it here at the IDC. The IDC has MOUs with several DFIs, and which facilitate, amongst other things, of course, benchmarking exercises. So towards the end of last year, for instance, we had another African DFI come and spend time with us, where we were sharing our processes, how we arrange our research, for instance. So the chief economist from that side came, and we spent a lot of time with our department so that we can have that cross-learning. And though they'd come to learn from us, we were also able to learn from them around, in discussions around how they do things and how they are able to share solve problems, And then the last point that I'm going to make, I mean, I think it's not something that's obvious, but something worth applying our minds to, which is around reframing public service so that we're able to attract the best and the brightest. I mean, there are a number of situations where people are trained in the public sector and then move on to the private sector. Now, this is not the worst thing in the world. However, we do need to be able to first attract and maintain some of the real key skills that are built out with. We've seen, countries that have really tried to elevate the status of public service, and so perhaps there are lessons that we can learn there, because I think then being able to maintain that skills base would be quite useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. I think this has probably been, for all of us, it has indeed been for me, very illuminating, the inputs from our panelists. It really has been great. The initial presentations and also the opening remarks. So we now have the opportunity to open the floor to questions from the audience. Let me just see how much time we've got left. We have around half an hour for questions from the audience. Elvis, can I ask, are there any questions? Could you read those to us? We've got 4 questions. Okay, so could you read those to us, please? Perhaps let's do it one by one so that we can then give our panelists the opportunity to respond.
Thanks, Patru. We do have 4 questions. The first is from Caleb. Building a strong entrepreneurial and innovation ecosystem is also critical for African development. How is sub-Saharan Africa countries building capability to produce APC in the pharma sector? Thanks for the insightful presentation. He adds.
Can I ask which one of our panelists would like to take that question?
So, I mean, I think as a DFI, this is something that we spend a lot of our time thinking about. And the IDC has really tried to introduce a number of interventions that can assist. So, for instance, we have a pre-investment department, which is really around supporting entrepreneurs that aren't yet our clients. in order to, to support, the capability building. We also support, I think, from even a policy perspective to ensure and support alignment and coordination of intervention so that we can have, more optimal optimal environment. And this is really out of recognition that finance, though important, is not the silver bullet, for supporting entrepreneurship. And I could make an example, for instance, around, some of the newer emerging industry opportunities that are coming around green hydrogen. So the IDC had coordinated the development of the commercialization strategy. We've brought in different players of the ecosystem that are relevant, and we are continuously working with all of them so that we can at least align the different investments so that the businesses and entrepreneurs that are stepping into that space aren't having to do the, the hard work of running around trying to make the linkages themselves. Thanks.
Thank you. Perhaps, okay, do you want to?
Yeah, just to add to that, so from our practice across the continent, we noticed that most of the entrepreneurs are SMEs. And Africa's private sector is probably 90% SMEs. And so among the many problems they have, we noticed that with the financing, one of them is access to finance. And the strongest challenges for first-time borrowers who have no credit record or credit history, or countries that have no asset registries for me to use any asset I have as collateral for borrowing. So going around that has been a strong challenge. So what we try to do is get the financial institutions to accept other forms of credit behavior as adequate basis for assessing and estimating whether somebody's creditworthy or not. For instance, how frequently I've paid my electricity bill, or how will I pay my social security, or something else that shows consistent, responsible credit behavior as a basis for assessing credit behavior for borrowing. And then also technical assistance, because the banks ask for, they have the KYC requirement, know your customer requirement, that asks for authentic addresses, which most African countries do not have. A well-labeled street address system is not everywhere as you have in South Africa. So I don't have an authentic address. I don't have an authentic biometric ID, also a challenge in many of the African countries we've been to. And then also I don't have 2 years audited accounts. I don't have the capability. So we have to also strengthen capabilities and efficiencies on their side, along with the access to finance innovations to help them make, and then also getting them to be investment ready. Most of them are not at the level where any serious scaling can happen as required to create jobs and all that.
Thanks. I just wanted to add the fact that a number of African countries are putting in place startup policies, which I think is a good starting point to holistically address those issues. Another important thing I've seen is the issue of creating market linkages between the large players and even government. Procurement can be used as a strategic tool through the preference platforms. And another one is common user facilities. So in Kenya, for example, there are common user facilities that can be utilized by SMEs where they go and they use a facility without having to set up from scratch on their own. And then at private sector level, when I was at the Association of Manufacturers, we set up an SME hub where we were able to bring SMEs, train them, link them to opportunities within the market, send them for learning sessions at different companies and manufacturing plants. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Clearly, that is a question that is very important. It is being addressed at very many levels, but still there's a lot of work to do. In the case of UNIDO itself, we've got a global clean tech innovation program that's currently running across 16 countries. And in South Africa, it is managed, it's implemented by the Technology Innovation Agency. It also looks at mentoring and supporting the innovators, the entrepreneurs, not only it helps them to make sure that their innovation is actually really, there's a market for it, and getting it up to the stage where it is bankable, if they have a bankable proposal. So, and also establishing linkages with the market, etc. So, okay, thanks very much for that question. The second one, thank you.
So the second is from Lorenza. directed to the UJ team. Pam worked at UJ at the point, so I think she can take this. What are the lessons South Africa can learn from Ghana's automotive, especially in public procurement, and Egypt pharmaceuticals relating to localization in your view?
I think that meant that the SARChI team. So, and I mean, I'm not very familiar with the Ghana case study and that approach. I'm a little bit familiar with what's happening in Egypt, and what they've done is it's aggressively gone with their incentives that they provide. They're also relatively close to the European market, which is one of the highest demand markets for automotive vehicles, and so they've leveraged that. But I think it would be quite beneficial if the team at UJ that worked on the case studies was able to come in on that particular question.
Thank you, Pamela. Is that something that you would like to address, Elvis, or should we ask Fiona?
I can attempt, but we do have a colleague also online, Rex. If he has any additions, I'm more than happy for him to come in. So we sort of analyzed the Kantaka case, particularly focusing on the auto in Ghana, not necessarily as a successful case, but also as probably much more emerging insights that is developing, particularly because Ghana is not known for sort of some specialty and capabilities in the auto sector. What is happening particularly regarding public procurement, I'm also quite skeptical about it. I do not necessarily think, though we do have some industrial policy supporting Kantaka automotives, there isn't much integration into procurement in my view. And I'm seeing procurement a lot more from government procuring vehicles, but also sort of parts and components for the production of some of these vehicles. I don't think there is a scale there happening, but we do see some pockets of some departments, some ministries trying to do this. Would that sort of unlock the opportunities, particularly when we discuss the Ghana case? I'm not particularly sure. We do know VW is also now assembling vehicles in Ghana. The collaborations between them are not clear-cut, and we do not necessarily also know that they're actually interacting. And I think probably we should also be focusing on some of these collaboration opportunities and seeing how some of these cases go. But it's something that would probably discussing with the team later, see if we can also do a much more focused analysis on to sort of bring out some of these issues a lot more.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that wants to add to the response?
I wanted to comment just based on the experience in Kenya, specifically on the automobile sector. We introduced at that time a preference and reservation for 40% local content for government procurement. And what that did, it actually saw a lot of purchase from the local assemblers within the country. That I think was really critical, and it was linked to them also working with the component manufacturing companies in the country. So maybe it's not the scale of South Africa, but I think I saw the growth of procurement at public sector. So I think having the preference and reservations is important. Of course, it led to the problem of delayed payments by government, which was another problem. But I think that reservation really did help in growing purchase by government. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Shall we move to the next question?
Sure. We do have a reaction from Rex. Can he? Okay.
Yes. Follow-up response.
No, just to say that it's interesting the case from Ghana, because the company initially started off as an engineering company that brought in the informal sector, unlike the usual situation where it's a public thing and then it expands into something much bigger. It's actually a private company and has evolved over time, involving the informal sector up till the stage where they're able to assemble cars and put them together on the market. But they're still facing challenges of competition on the market, and for that reason, the cars are not as affordable as one would expect, especially to reach back to the informal sector in the way in which they started. But yes, we take on the comments, and there's definitely some more to do, and some more uncovering to do to bring out the nuances and to show the rules in which specific targeted policies play in this case. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rex. What was the next one then? Thank you.
From Santos, there was a discussion on fiscal incentives as one of the key drivers for industrialization. While this has in fact been used worldwide, how do we balance this with the limited fiscal space that many African countries face? Is it not redundant, given that investors in most countries do not necessarily see this or rank this as a major obstacle?
Who would like to take that?
I think, thanks for the question on fiscal incentives. The reality is currently the fiscal space is very limited. As you try and work on industrial policy across the continent, the reality of government's budgets being limited, and a big part of it is debt repayments, has been a struggle for many countries, because incentives sometimes require government to forgo revenues. When you're looking at regulatory streamlining, sometimes it's duplication of payments by government agencies, but they do it because they need the revenue and everything. But I think one of the ways to see the best and most strategic use of fiscal incentives is through sector prioritization. Because as you implement the National Development Agenda and industrial policy, it's important not to do it across everything because of the limited budgets, but to prioritize sectors. And in those priority sectors, to then come up with strategic initiatives. Sometimes even looking at the cost benefit analysis and saying, if we forgo this as government, what would then be the return in terms of investment? So developing and having those conversations in West Africa, for example, there's a time we're looking at incentives for some investors in the apparel sector. And it took a cost-benefit analysis by government, clearly looking at what that would mean to their fiscal revenue. So I think prioritization is one of the critical things, but also in the long term, looking at the debt sustainability issue and seeing how we address that for us to be able to unlock industrial policy and strategy for growth.
So let me wear my Ministry of Finance cap for 5 minutes. I was working Ministry of Finance a couple of years back. So we need to take a second look at the competition between African countries to attract investors through tax rebates. It's becoming a race to the bottom and really affecting African countries. Now the same investors from the mining sector or oil drilling company, whatever which sector they belong to, that you give the tax rebates to, after they come in, use very creative accounting tricks to avoid to send money out through very unpalatable systems. So trillions of dollars leaves the continent through illicit financial flows and transfer pricing and all other kinds of practices that are very unfriendly to the economy. So we need to look at that area very, very critically. It's becoming very detrimental to our development aspirations as opposed to. I think SADC has a finance and investment protocol that sets a certain benchmark that tax rebates should not go below a certain point or beyond a certain point. So that, but in West Africa and other regions, you don't have that. So whilst you are trying to be strict, country B goes behind you, offers a better, more attractive package, and you lose the investment. So we need to standardize that across our respective recs as well to make sure there's adequate responsibility, because we are very highly indebted now. We need the revenues. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. You also.
Yes, if I can add just briefly. So, I mean, this issue around the fiscal space is obviously a very real one for most African countries. But there are a number of things that I think we can also think about. So, for instance, from a fiscal perspective, people tend to focus around the debt to GDP ratio, right? So if you're taking debt to expand GDP, you might actually work out better than taking debt for some of the other expenditures that don't necessarily expand your denominator, which is GDP. So then there's also an element of strategic application that you need to apply in what you borrow for and when you expect to be able to make those returns. So I think that's an important element of the conversation. Then the second part is around, and I'm going to talk about actually tax incentives and the rebates. I think that this is actually, particularly when you're looking at new industries or industries that aren't currently present in the country, it's something that's worthwhile to explore. And this is because, for instance, the trade-off is if you're going to give a tax rebate, that means that you're foregoing tax revenues. But if it's a new industry, you aren't getting that tax revenue. So you can forego the tax revenue for a certain amount of years so that you can have it later on in the future. So that intertemporal, I think, trade-off is one worth engaging on. Of course, we must look at the issues that Manuel has raised around illicit financial flows, and there is, I think, increasing tools that are being utilized. I think our South African Revenue Services is getting better and better at dealing and addressing these issues. So at that level, public institutions could also share and learn. And I think the other aspect of it is, I mean, I think it's quite difficult from the finance perspective. I've also been in that space because you have competing needs. So really just prioritizing, and this is not something that's typical, industrial policy is not something that's always typically popular from finance ministry space, but really if we could just highlight the role and importance of industrial development in actually driving growth and the growth stories of these countries, we might be able to, inter-engage then in these more strategic conversations around the debt to GDP ratio and the temporal trade-offs around tax rebates. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Pamela. Anything else? Another question? There was a fourth one, correct?
Yes, and Prof. Banji's hand is up. But if I may, Prof. Banji, there's a question particularly directed to you regarding the recognition of prior learning from Coward Frederick. How to convert our current system to a system that meaningfully recognizes lifelong training so that people can improve their livelihoods over time. And sorry, there is also one more from Gordon that is also directed, I believe, to Prof. Banji around the youth bank and how it can be set up to coordinate and scrutinize proposals from young ones to see the potential viability of proposals. He's arguing that it will go a long way in addressing the youth unemployment we are facing as a continent. If you have any thoughts on that, it would be good for you to share as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. So let me address the issue of the. You can hear me, right?
Yes, fine.
Okay. So the first question on the Youth Entrepreneurial Investment Bank, as I said, is an initiative of the FDB. If a country, for example, is interested, I think you could do an expression of interest to the bank, through the country office of the bank. And I believe I really want to encourage all countries to put this forward. For example, I remember in the Nigerian case, the bank is putting forward almost $100 million. We believe that will leverage close to $1 billion over time. So it is something that we should all take very seriously. The second one is on the lifelong learning. As I said, I believe that we have not paid much attention to technical education. I know a lot of us are university-based, university-focused people. And in my country, I know for sure they look down on that level. But that is the engine of growth. That is where you have people who fix things on a daily basis. And that's what Germany, Japan, Korea, go and look at all the cases. In fact, last year, 2023, there was a study, joint study, EFDB, ILO, did it, and the World Bank actually, on how to, reform TVET, they call it, technical and vocational educational training. I think we should actually pay more attention to it. That's where those who make things on a daily basis are. The university people can do their design, the engineering, but who maintains these things? Who maintains the factory system? So this is where Germany has been a leading country. You can go out, look at it online. And it was copied, of course, by Japan in the early days, by all of the Korean and all the other East Asian tigers. And I believe very strongly that, African countries need to pay particular attention and investment in this technical and vocational training. The point I wanted to make also is on the solution to the issue of fiscal space. I agree with colleagues on the debt burden that Africa is facing. Many of these countries jumped into commercial, loans that are so unsustainable. It never used to be like this. But partly also, I think, the issue of public finance management is key. People don't like to talk about it. But I'm sorry, there's so much corruption in our system, and we have to address it. So people shy away from it. They shy away from governance issues. We talk policy, but who is policy? Who's going to do it? There are human beings that has to do it. It's people, the bureaucrats, the politicians. They have to make it work. When it fails, it's them that make it fail. So I think we have a governance institute now, the Africa Development Bank, where they're trying to advocate for this. And the issue of green minerals and the rare minerals that we've been talking about, that is a zone where you have to have very strong political will. We can talk for the next 10 years. It's not going to happen if we don't pay attention to the politics of it. All of these folks come. There was a study we did in the bank that shows that processing these minerals in Africa is about half the cost of doing it in Europe or anywhere else. You can go online and find it. Yet, the big powers, and I'm not going to mention them, they just come and take away the minerals. It's happening in my country, Nigeria now. It's becoming the same story like the crude oil issue. You find, young people, artisanal, in very terrible conditions, going around mining these things and giving them to whoever they are giving it in the night. So I think we should not be shying away from the hard questions, from the hard issues. So public finance management, governance, and leadership is going to be key. The final point I would like to make is a solution also that I think is in this report on the zone arrangement. We started in 2017 on what we call the special agro-industrial processing zones at the bank. We've raised close to $2 billion. We're in 12 countries. I'm happy to provide details to colleagues and 25 different sites. Why do we call it special agro zones? Because agriculture is where Africa has comparative advantage. And when you look at the forward-backward linkages in agribusiness, it's huge. 40% of global jobs are in that space. So we did our homework and we adapted the special economic zone model to create these zones across Africa. At the African Investment Forum in Rabat in November of last year, I don't know whether any of you were there, we raised $2.2 billion for the 10 new states in Nigeria alone. And so many other countries are also doing it. So I believe this is a way to go. The study actually, the IDR actually recommend the zonal arrangement. China alone has close to almost 3,000 zones. Vietnam has about, God knows, 700 now. There's a recent study by, what's her name, Margaret, this lady from Tufts, one of our students in Vietnamese who was showing. If I was telling her, oh, I read somewhere, Vietnam has 480 zones. I said, no. It's close to 650 zones now. And 90% of them are actually based on agro-processing. As a matter of fact, in 5 categories of agri-products alone, black pepper, cashew, shrimps, you know what Vietnam exported last year? $40 billion. 40 billion. Processed, not raw materials. 40 billion. It's more than all Nigeria exported in crude oil. So that is, for me, one of the areas that Africa should focus on. I'm not ruling out the digital space. I'm not ruling out energy transition. I'm not ruling out all of those. Those are, many of them are high tech. You know, I don't see a single API in Africa. You know, active pharmaceutical factory in Africa. Those are high tech, and Africa will continue to be lagging in those areas. But let's catch up by making use of what we have through proper governance, through proper leadership, and all of us focusing on those issues that we don't want to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be follow-ups to get those linkages that you offered for more information. Anybody else who would like to add before we close this part of the session? There's a question from the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Kiro Sichongwe. I'm coming from the University of Johannesburg. Diego mentioned about finance, something to do with finance. Now my question stems from there. I would like to find out what innovative financing mechanisms can support industrial development in Africa. And then just a short question also, I think this one should go to Fiona, who was talking about the sectors that could be viable in terms of realizing industrialization on the continent. I would like to find out, what measures can be proposed in order to enhance the role of small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa's industrial landscape. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Diego, do you want to respond to that question, the first part that was addressed to you?
Thank you. I think we have experts here from the African Development Bank and IDC and other people that can bring more light into this. There are many things that UNIDO is doing, but UNIDO is not really financial institutions. We try to assist small and medium enterprises into getting to the level where they can apply for a loan or access some kind of microcredit, things like that. So we work on the technical side most of the time, though we have some financial mechanisms that we have worked, but I think it's more for a question for Banji or Pamela. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. Shall we start with you, Pamela, and then go to you, Banji?
Sure. So, I mean, I think different institutions use different mechanisms. I'll speak a little bit about some of the things that the IDC is doing. And for context, our mandate is largely industrial development, but we do from time to time support, the services sectors because of the linkages. And also, I think, high-value agriculture. So I think there are a number of things. So it's about continuous observation of what's happening in markets. And one of the things that we've observed, for instance, is the changing business models in machinery and equipment. And looking at that, we then had to adjust how we fund that sector. Because previously, mines used to buy machinery. And so the cost of the machinery didn't sit on the balance sheet of the actual firm that produced the machinery. How the industry has evolved now is that if you're producing processing machinery, the mine actually pays you for ore that is processed rather than outright for the machinery. So that machinery will sit on the balance sheet of the equipment or machinery producer for some years, making then, working capital potentially an issue. So if you are financing a company in that industry the standard way, it doesn't really support, the kind of challenges that they're facing. So keeping up with your product design and development with what's happening in actual industries is quite important. Then something else that we've been doing that I think is really starting to yield results is around, I think in 2021, the IDC introduced a project development department. This department funds projects at pre-feasibility level stages. And the IDC will take equity in that company, and it will sell some of that back to the company at a later point. It will also walk the journey, with the, you know, with the entrepreneurs or the business people that are working on that idea. So we'll work with them on pre-feasibility, feasibility, get it all the way to bankability, and then graduate it to some of our more standard products. And that's simply because if you're starting, particularly in some of these nascent industries or even newer industries to the particular economy, the amount of work that needs to happen and that needs to be funded before a project is ready, you know, for bankability stage can sometimes be quite significant. I'll leave it at those examples, but I mean, there are quite a number of other products that we can talk about perhaps after the session.
Thank you very much. I also, just before I get to you, Banji, just encourage people to, when we break for lunch now, that you can actually engage with our speakers and our panelists during lunch. Banji, okay, so over to you for your input, please.
Thank you very much, colleagues. So there are several initiatives actually in the bank that you know, try to push both women and youth. There's one of them is called the Enable Youth Fund that supports young people in agriculture. Another one, I'm sure many of you might have heard of AFAWA. AFAWA was actually celebrated recently in Paris as a major success, and I believe the whole of the program of AFAWA is actually to breach the guaranteed deficit of $42 billion for women financing. It's actually a guarantee program. It offers grants for technical assistance to financial institutions that are lending to women. Then, of course, earlier I mentioned the YABE. YABE is still in its early phases, but I believe that it's a very, very promising youth entrepreneurial investment bank. It's a bank for young people, run by young people for young people's business. Actually, that's actually the slogan. Because anytime a young people goes to a bank, and they tell you don't have collateral, you are too young. Now, when is he going to grow up? By the time he grows up, he's not young anymore. So what that program is trying to create this ecosystem of you know, financial institutions that will be run by them. It's purely private sector based. It's going to be run in a very professional way. So, and that's one, I believe, one of the very promising areas for financing and bridging the space for this very expensive, costly loan that we have in our system. The other one is called IDIs. It's called Innovative Innovation Investment in Digital and Creative Enterprise for young people. I know that for the Nigerian program, I'm mentioning it because I'm a bit involved in that. It's in several countries now. It's called I-DICE. It's for the creative space, also for digital space for young people. When the Nigerian program was launched last year, about $620 million. And it wasn't just the AFDB, it was also the AED, it was ISDB, were all involved. And our hope is that it's going to leverage up to $3 billion in 5 years. So, and it's purely for young people, talking about creative jobs, talking about decent jobs. That's really something that, you know, is being promoted throughout the African space. The last one I would like to mention was also something called NASAL. It's also a guarantee program. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of NASAL. It's a risk program that a fund actually that actually allows commercial banks to loan to small-scale farmers and encourage them to at a very low single-digit interest rate. So there are several programs in the bank, and for those who are interested, you can also approach the country manager or the director for the region. In all of the regions now have director generals, deputy director manager, they have managers. that you can easily reach them online to inquire about this, and they will give you directions on how best to log into those programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am sure there still are quite a number of questions, and there are quite a number of people who would like to add what has been said, but I am afraid we need to stop our program here. I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Pamela, Emmanuel, Phyllis, and then Banji Online. Thank you very much, and I'd like you to ask you to give them a round of applause, please.
Sure. Wow.
Okay, so we are, as I said, getting to the end of our proceedings. Just very briefly, some notes from what we've heard today. As outlined in the presentations, Africa must accelerate progress in 3 areas: innovation, clean energy, and economic growth. And then we also heard that well-crafted industrial policies that are collaborative, SDG-oriented, future-ready, and regionally coordinated can help accelerate progress in these areas. And then finally, we also heard how policy actions and strategies across the region are harnessing digitalization, the energy transition, and the rebalancing of global value chains to offer solutions and drive industrial development forward. So now what remains for me is to invite Dr. Diego Macero to do his closing remarks. And I'd also then just like to remind all of you that you can access the report online at UNIDO's website, www.unido.org/IDR 2024. Diego, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Yeah, closing remarks. I will try to briefly summarize what we have heard. And we started with a discussion about the global poly crisis, where Alejandro mentioned that the SDGs progress is an achievement, it's at risk. So what to do from there? And we look at key messages, key issues that could contribute to deal with the situation. One was the regional integration, particularly for Africa, but in general, globally, regional integration plays a strong role on addressing what we are saying, this global poly crisis. Skills development is essential to also do job creation and innovation to deal with the advantages of the new technologies. So in order to address all these four issues, industrialization's policies are a key factor to address them. And in particular, the industrial policies are necessary, but they need to be, and again, in that Alejandro mentioned four points, which are very important, is that are in the report, and it says industrial policy needs to be mission-oriented, future-ready, collaborative, and we heard from different speakers what the importance of that, and regionally coordinated. In addition, we saw some opportunities that also our speakers elaborated on, and one is the green industrialization, the opportunities to the creation of industrial hubs, to focus on innovation and technology upgrading, particularly for the youth, and we heard also about the youth entrepreneurial banks, and the importance of regional value chains. All of those to address the opportunity of green growth. There were many other comments, opinions, and issues discussed, but I think those are the primary that I would like to highlight. And with this, I would like to really thank all the rich discussion that was generated by the excellent presenters and panelists, and the public and the audience that has been with us. I also would like to mention that the next industrial development report is already starting to be produced with similar partners of the 2024. So the 2025 will have a different objective. It will be looking into the future of industrialization. So I'm really looking forward to that report. And before closing, I would really like to thank all our partners, the University of Johannesburg and IDC, and all the panelists, the excellent panelists, and the organizers of the event, the teams of IDC, the team of the University of Johannesburg, and from UNIDO, to the excellent work of Petro and Claire in supporting this event. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Diego, and thank you to all of you. We would like to now invite our guests in the room to join us for lunch outside. If we say goodbye to our participants online, we really appreciate that you stayed with us for the whole morning. So it's goodbye from us. But before we all leave, I'd just like all the speakers and panelists to come to the front for a group photograph, and then we can join the rest of the group outside for